So far, we've been talking exclusively about muscles activated at 100% of their activation capabilities. When we talked about doing this experiment with some source of power and a frog muscle, we said we wanted to just zap it with as much power as possible so we didn't have to worry about sub-maximal muscle contractions. But as you might guess, inside the body, you don't always activate your muscles at full capacity. So in this video, I want to go over how to think about what happens when we scale up and scale down the force length and force velocity curves by muscle activations. So let's just jump into reviewing muscle fiber length and muscle force properties. We get this, like we just saw in the last video, we get this very characteristic curve with a maximum at the optimal fiber length. Maybe I could just call it L sub naught for length optimal. Get a curve that looks like this. Now, what happens when you are not contracting? So maybe we should label this 100% activation. You'll be happy to hear that it's relatively straightforward to scale this curve down by whatever percentage of a maximum muscle activation you're getting at. All you do is you just multiply by whatever percent. So let's say we're contracting our muscles at 80% of maximum activation. We just multiply by the whole thing by 0.8. So you get something like, I don't know, this. And maybe you're only contracting your muscles at, 0.2, so 20%, and then you just multiply everything by 0.2. Doing my best to draw what that would actually look like. 0.2. Maybe I'll annotate this 1.0 for full activation. So muscle activation just scales this down. And it turns out the same is true for the force velocity relationship. So let's sketch out what that looks like. We have a few important points on that force velocity relationship. One of them is the Vmax, the maximum shortening velocity of muscle. So hopefully you recall we got this characteristic curve like this. This over here being eccentric muscle contractions, you can produce a little bit more force, maybe 20 to 80% more than your 100% of maximum isometric force, which is right here. By the way, this point right there should correspond to that point right there, assuming we did this force velocity curve at optimal fiber length. And we'll talk in a moment about what happens when that's not the case. So happily, the same thing is the case here. So if this magenta curve is 1.0 full activation, say we are only activating our muscles at 50%, well, everything just scales down by a factor of 0.5. We can actually eyeball here, right? This would be, if this is 100 times 0.5, this should be 50%. Everything should have kind of the same shape, but just scaled down by a factor of 5. And of course, 0 times 0.5 is still 0, so should look just like that. So the takeaway is whatever the force velocity relationship is, or whatever the force length relationship is, you can just multiply it by, let's call it the muscle activation, maybe A, and that's just going to be between 0 and 1. 0 for your muscles are completely off. 1 is 100% muscle activation. Of course, there's much more to talk about with regards to where does muscle activation come from and how quickly can it change and all of that. But let's save that for maybe for next week. Now, there's one more piece that we need to think about with regards to these two curves, which is how to combine them. And there's a few ways to do that, and we'll talk about it in the next video.